welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name's Dennis Riggs. I'm your host for the next half hour as we take a look at agricultural issues here in Champaign County and the surrounding area. Agriculture is a very important industry in Champaign County, and many consumers have maybe lost that touch with the true operation here in our area. So what our hope today is to bring this to you. I am a fourth generation farmer here in Champaign County down in the Sidney area. Also serve currently on the Champaign County Farm Bureau Board of Directors from Raymond Township. We're very happy to have with us today Tamara White. Tamara's come all the way from Bloomington to be with us here with the Illinois Farm Bureau. Tamara, tell us about your position with the Illinois Farm Bureau. What do you do up there?
Well, Dennis, I focus mostly on commodities programs and activities, educational programs, crop production, and then international trade and marketing of those products.
We all need trade and marketing, that's for sure. Give me a bit of your background, where you've been to school, what have brought you to this position with the Illinois Farm Bureau?
Born and raised in Minnesota, large family. My father was 7 of 8 sons. Both of my grandfathers were farmers, and my uncle's farm in Sibley County, Minnesota is currently being farmed by my cousin. And I worked in Washington, D.C. for 12 years after graduating from Stanford, and I got my master's at Virginia Tech, worked in ag policy and marketing out there, and moved back to Illinois in 1998.
Well, you are the perfect person then to get this discussion off today, because we're going to be talking about the USDA and farm programs. Many times consumers hear about farm programs and farm program payments, things that the USDA is doing for, sometimes against the farmers. Let's get started on the big picture. What is the USDA? What's it stand for? What's its purpose?
Well, the USDA is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's one of the federal agencies that's responsible basically for all food, hunger, and nutrition programs in the United States, as well as conservation programs, foreign marketing assistance for agricultural products. They also handle inspection at the border and also food safety inspections in our plants and many, many other activities.
They keep real busy. It's a pretty good size operation and takes money to run an operation like that. Let's take a look at our first slide today, and that slide talks about the amount of money that is spent by the U.S. government on agriculture and what slice of the pie we are. Tell us, it looks like just a little bitty slice. What's the deal there?
It's a very tiny slice, and if you actually broke it down further, what you'd see in that part that is the USDA budget is that a lot of that is actually for food stamps and the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, which are 2 of the feeding programs we talked about earlier. So actually USDA's budget is very, very tiny, and of that, much of it is for hunger and nutrition programs here in this country.
That's what, and I think a lot of people think about the USDA as being a farmer-only agency and directly to the production agriculture. But as you can see, there's a lot of other things involved. As far as other programs people haven't heard about, so what's some of the weirder programs you've heard about that the USDA is involved in?
Well, I mean, they're really, in terms of past investment and even current investment in experiment, research, and extension, the university land grant system. They're really responsible for water quality, conservation programs. I mean, everything from whether or not someone is keeping their field in grasses or in conservation reserve, or whether or not they're putting it into row crops. USDA does that. They also do inspections. They have extension folks out in the areas that are supported by the university system that they advise and that can help with crop diseases, or soybean rust is a good example, avian influenza if it ever were to occur in this country. USDA is very involved in how that will be handled and how we prepare ourselves for it.
So a lot of times when we talk about what a government agency does, it's not necessarily doing it for the farmers, but rather helping them take care of their own operations, whether it be regulatory or preparedness, as in the rust situation.
Right.
We also have a slide number 11, that talks about these various different programs. If we get into that, there's a lot of breakdown. You talked about the women and infant children, the food stamps. Is that all part of the farm USDA budget?
Yes, it is. And in fact, it's one of the things that endears the urban legislators much more to the farm programs and to USDA, because many of the folks who receive that assistance are actually in large cities. And so that's a very important budget. It's very important to larger cities, to single mothers. And so that program helps endear the whole agriculture department to urban legislators.
Well, this kind of brings us back to the fact that agriculture touches everybody, whether we talk about it 3 times a day as we eat our meals, sometimes 4 for people like me, or people that need assistance putting food on the table. The USDA budget takes care of all of that. Is that a good thing? Does Farm Bureau think that's a good thing, or is it a bad thing?
Oh, absolutely. I think if anyone were to say, well, who would you want handling your nutrition programs and your feeding programs in this country, it's much more efficient to have the agricultural department involved than to have a whole separate agency or an agency that's regulatory like the Food and Drug Administration. You wouldn't want them administrating your food and nutrition programs, because really there's a lot of synergies created by the fact that the Ag Department both works with the production side and some of the distribution side, and then also directly with the consumer.
Are we not unique here in the United States of America, having a Department of Agriculture and an agency with a cabinet level position, by the way, that sits next to the president and makes these types of decisions? Do other countries do it the same way, or is there different approaches to agriculture in other countries?
Well, most of them will have a Ministry of Agriculture. Whether or not it's cabinet level or, 3rd or 4th in line for the presidency is another story, but it really depends on the importance of agriculture in that country. And I think in many countries you've seen they've combined their agriculture, their environment, their conservation, and some of their food safety things all into one agency. But I think the bulk of the agricultural side has to really also focus on production, research, extension, outreach, and not necessarily on regulation, which is what many of the other agencies do.
As you drive around Champaign County, you see a lot of urban expansion, you see a lot of new development, you see farmland being turned into urban development, and I see a lot of conservation things going on as far as water right-of-ways that have been dammed up to keep the runoff going through. You see where silt has been contained so it's not going into our waterways. Does the USDA have anything to do with those types of programs, because it has to do with dirt and water movement?
They do, and they work, they have to work with EPA and others, but they do, they're very responsible to the extent that we also have wetlands involved and enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, and also in some of the testing and the quality requirements for water. But there's also, again, the regulatory side, the EPA, which is generally the one that comes in and restricts and does regulations on folks or says that they're in violation of regulations.
I know you've been to Washington, D.C. many times. You've been inside the USDA. It's a fairly good-sized organization, I understand. Can you give us a little bit of an insight of what you've seen inside the U.S. Department of Agriculture?
Well, I used to, when I first started working in Washington, my family never really understood exactly what I did, so they used to tell people I worked for USDA. And I would say, well, no, I don't. There's about 300 or 400 other thousand people who do, 300,000 or 400,000, but I am not one of them. And what's interesting that I would tell them, however, when they similarly joked about red tape in Washington, is that the bureaucrats that work in Washington are very hardworking, and we consider ourselves hardworking here in the Midwest, but these people have to commute an hour and a half just to get to that big cement building there in Washington, and then they work very hard for folks. A lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy, but they administer hundreds of millions of dollars and many, many farm programs. They also put out the crop report, which is one of those weird things we kind of laugh about that USDA does. But they put out a crop report every quarter, and those are read worldwide. And those are very time-consuming, statistical, but they're about the best guess we can have of a production year, and they do help farmers with their marketing decisions.
An important agency, but maybe because of the fact it's overseeing an important industry, American agriculture. People look at American agriculture as a leader in production, efficiency, and safety. They also look at the United States as a price setter, as in the Chicago Board of Trade, where the prices are set worldwide. Is American agriculture as an industry and a business a leader in the world?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're probably one of the most competitive agricultural systems in the world. We may not be the most competitive if you look at things like cost of land, but if you add everything together, research, extension, land costs, quality of education of producers, marketing and information services available, we are by far one of the most competitive, and we are very important in terms of the overall economy, jobs, tax revenues, and contribution to rural infrastructure.
Well, to keep that important and big industry going in the right direction, there has to be an overall goal or an overall direction. And many people refer to that as the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, of course, is what directs the United States Department of Agriculture in their programs. What exactly is the Farm Bill? Is it, are we talking about a dollar bill? Or are we talking about something you owe as a bill? Or what is a Farm Bill?
It always seems like it should just be a little booklet, but it's really a collection of laws and legislation and policies related to agriculture. It's related to agriculture, and as we talked about before, the hunger and nutrition programs and food distribution. And basically it covers farm programs in general, but it has individual titles, 8 or 10 of them, that cover everything from conservation to agricultural trade to food and nutrition programs, foreign aid to commodity programs, etc.
Has it been around forever, or is it just something that started in the last few years? How long have we had farm bills?
Pretty much since 1933. That was the first Agricultural Adjustment Act, and that we would call the first Farm Bill. It was one of the New Deal area public support programs that happened after World War I, and was kind of to stabilize the economic hardship of those times leading up to the Great Depression.
Well, of course, the ag industry is a tremendous industry. We have a slide that shows agriculture's contribution into the economy, and we like to think of agriculture as a driving force and many times a solution to some of our economic woes rather than the problem. Is agriculture important in the overall U.S. economy?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when the Farm Bill was first passed, if you think back then, our agriculture probably used about 22% of our workforce back then, and even though now it maybe only uses 2% of our workforce, that's on actually working on the land. If you count all the industries in between, from the collection and distribution, the warehousing, the drying, the processing, I mean, if you just look around here at the Andersons or at ADM or Cargill, Kraft Foods, they employ hundreds of thousands of people, because you can't just hand a kernel of corn to somebody to eat. You're going to process it into many, many things, which either become ingredients or branded products, and then again those have to be distributed out to the supermarkets or the restaurants or the food banks or whatever. So it's a huge industry that employs many hundreds of thousands and even millions of people in this country, because it's all tied into the transportation infrastructure.
Well, all the stuff that's controlled by agriculture needs that Farm Bill. Let's get back to that for just a second, because I know a lot of people maybe are not familiar with the fact that you talked about the different sections of it. What would a consumer, as watching this program today, how could they possibly be affected by a Farm Bill, either that goes awry or that keeps agriculture strong in the United States?
Well, if you go back to maybe the most basic example, back in the 30s, when really probably people would consider the reason behind the Farm Bill to keep people in rural areas, keep workers in rural areas, maintain our production ability in those rural areas. A lot of the concepts behind stabilizing rural farm area income was to keep people from going to the cities and all moving into the slums, along with all the immigrants and all competing for jobs in the cities. So that was something back then that even now, if you live in a big city, you're pretty happy when you can take a weekend off and go out for a drive, and you've got a beautiful landscape, you've got well-preserved and maintained land, you've got plants, adding oxygen back to the atmosphere that our cars are taking out with their engines. And so really, I think in addition to that rural-urban balance, people like the thought, many people came from farming, from farm families, and they like the thought that this is out there going on, these people are working, they're the salt of the earth, they're producing nutritious, wholesome food for us, and we can work here in the city, but we like to go out and visit out there. We like that there are lakes and clean rivers and farms and animals, that we don't have to be right there in the middle of the city with them all.
I heard a gentleman once refer to agricultural economics as pretty simple. He says it's probably one of the only areas where you see the combination of natural resources and labor to produce a product. And pure and simple, that's what agriculture is. It takes the good soil of our land, and it takes the rain from Mother Nature, and with a farmer's help puts that together, grows a seed, and produces a product. Now, what examples for our consumers out there, what kind of different products does American agriculture produce? I know you're involved in exporting different products, helping farmers in the commodity programs through the Farm Bureau. What type of products should we grow here in Illinois?
Well, here in Illinois, we grow largely corn, soybeans, and we feed cattle and hogs, and some turkeys, a little bit of poultry. We are one of the largest pumpkin producing states in the nation. We also produce some popcorn, and then you also have all of the Christmas trees, the nursery stock, and all of those things. A lot of folks would eat sweet corn this time of year. And you mentioned something earlier about consumers. One of the things I think that should endear consumers to farmers is anyone who's a summer gardener who puts their garden in this time of year and they love it and they want the fresh tomatoes or whatever, this fresh squash. Everything that they face, every weather risk, every plant risk, every pest, every weed, every deer that comes on and eats their crop, that same thing happens to the farmer on a much larger scale. And I think for many summer gardeners, they really appreciate farmers because they realize I would never want to put up with this kind of risk, on 1,000 acres of land. I can barely handle it in my own garden.
A garden puts agriculture in your own backyard.
That's right.
And I like for people to give that a try because it's not an easy thing.
No, it's not.
Let's talk about that farm bill again. Now, if I grow strawberries and sweet corn in my backyard in town, should I have anything to do with the farm bill, or is this for farmers only?
Probably. Actually, there are 98% of eligible producers in this country are part of the farm program. So basically it involves being eligible and then applying to be in certain programs. And so if you're a cotton and rice farmer down in Alabama, you might apply to be in those commodity programs. You also might apply for the Conservation Reserve Program. If you have a wetlands area that really shouldn't be farmed, you can apply to keep that out of farming and keep it in wetlands or wildlife preservation. There are not commodity programs for fruit and vegetable growers, so those folks have to rely on other things that are part of the work that USDA does, like helping to foreign market our products overseas. But basically the program crops are corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, rice, etc. And then there are other products like sugar and dairy that have programs for them, as well as tobacco, mohair, honey. And a lot of those programs have very strange histories to why they have a specific program for that crop.
Well, let's talk about the history. I'm glad you brought that, the history of the Farm Bill itself. Has there always been a Farm Bill directed by Congress that directs the USDA, or how long has that type of legislation been around?
Well, there is the commodity programs of the Farm Bill, which have been in place since the 30s. They are permanent legislation, which is kind of a strange thing. It means that if we don't tweak and change the farm legislation, all the package of legislation that affects agriculture, if you don't tweak and change it every 4 to 6 years, you could conceivably revert back to that 1933 bill, which I'm sure probably would cause us to produce things that aren't marketable, that we don't want to produce, that really are not in our best interest. So what the Congress does, and the President and the USDA every 4 to 6 years, is they try to strategize, what can we do in the context of the legislation that supports the farm program? What can we do to change that to evolve into more of a modern society? And that's what a lot of the discussion is going on about now, is what should the U.S. be producing? How should our programs fit into the trade negotiations? How should they be related to conservation or to biofuels production, etc.?
As we take a look at the outlay by USDA for farm programs, and we talked about that just a small percentage that actually goes to production agriculture, is it important, where should the money come from for the farmer? Should it be coming from the government through subsidies and payments for services? What do you think is USDA's goal for where the money should come from to actually keeping agriculture as a viable industry here in the United States?
Well, I think the ideal world, and I think even for farmers, they want the money to come from the market. And the challenge is that the market is not always rational in this area, because we have had farm programs since 1933, and so you have some markets that maybe there's some production in that probably there wouldn't be in if it was just a world market price. But you also you have things that you are a part of, like a world trade negotiation, where you're perhaps not confident you're going to be able to get the money from the market until that's done and the ink is dry. And so you therefore have a reason to have a safety net of some sort to ensure that you do have some production in your country. We talk about food security. That sometimes is an okay term, sometimes it seems to be not such an okay term, but I think American consumers do want to have some level of confidence that they can get some amount of food from their own country. If we had to import 30 to 60% of our food like the island of Japan does, I don't think American consumers would be very happy with that. And so I think most people want to get the money from the market, but they recognize that they do need the government there for a safety net in times of, world financial crisis or challenges in trade negotiations or weather problems.
You brought up food security, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's the question I wanted to ask you. Right now, in my current lifetime, I only remember back on September 11th when my local gas station down in Sydney had a line and the prices skyrocketed after the bombing of the World Trade Center. And I thought, geez, I may not be able to buy gasoline here in the next few days. What's going to happen? People were lining up, beginning to panic. In food, that's gasoline security, that's fuel security. In food security, I can never remember, nor can my father or my grandfather remember a time when you walked in the grocery store and the shelves were bare, yet in other countries that does happen.
It did happen.
As a consumer, should we be concerned about food security?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, you're always hearing about other countries that have various animal disease and other problems that we had. Foot and mouth disease in Europe, we had mad cow disease in England. Right now we have avian influenza in other countries, and so there's always a challenge to when you have global markets and things trading across borders. If you have one country that's primarily producing all the poultry in the world and something happens, everybody else is at risk. And so I think on a global basis, folks are trying to sort of diversify where they get their food from. If you look at our country, what we import is not our staples like corn and soybeans and pork and beef. What we import are the fun things like coffee and orange juice and rubber and sugar and tropical products, sometimes pineapples from Hawaii, things that we can't really grow very well on the continental U.S. But that doesn't mean that we should produce all those things. That's okay to buy those because those are sort of specialty items. But if you can imagine if every day for your bread all your wheat was imported, that might be a little bit scary. I think on a global basis we're sort of moving to that direction where everything can move across borders, but I think right now people feel like they want to have some level of comfort. They know where their food's coming from.
Do you think that part of the USDA's goal is to also make that secure food image that the American farmer has right now? Because as you say, these other diseases and problems we see in foreign countries and we see it on the news at night, yet it's not affecting us here. That's a great thing. That's a wonderful thing for us to have in America. Do you think as a consumer in other countries, is it important for them to be assured that American agriculture remains strong?
Oh yeah, I think in fact one of our biggest trading partners is still Japan, and they have a great deal of confidence in our food and our food system. Now we might hear a lot about the fact they're not taking our beef right now because we've had 3 cases of BSE discovered in this country, all related to the feed, not to animals passing them or anything like that. But I think the Japanese still, if you found the average Japanese consumer on the street, they basically believe our food is safe and healthy, and they buy a lot of our products just as we buy other products. You wouldn't think twice about buying Walker's shortbread down at the little British import shop and having some British cookies, and I think other countries feel that way about us.
What a great situation that we are in here in the United States for having a safe food supply. Do you think that the USDA is that one of their major things that they want to continue, or is the budget cuts, are we going to run on the ragged edge of the food supply being maybe not as safe as it has been?
Well, that's a good question because they've transferred much of that to Homeland Security. So a lot of the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service and others, those are now in the Homeland Security area. So I guess that's a vote of confidence that they will be funded in the future.
Should we be concerned about the food we buy? You made some excellent examples of the coffee or the cocoa or the pineapples. Of course, pineapples, that's USDA actually with Hawaii,
Right.
or they do come from other areas. Does the USDA watch about products coming into our country as well as the ones that are going out of our country?
Absolutely. They're a huge information network. They have Foreign Ag Service specialists around the world that are constantly monitoring for outbreaks of production, disease problems in animals or crops. And then we have our inspectors at the border. Most likely, if anyone has seen them, they're either in the border coming in from Mexico or Canada, where they ask you to take all your fresh fruit out, or if you're at the airport and you come in from a country where you've been on a farm and they ask to wash your shoes at the airport, those are the USDA inspectors trying to keep out foreign animal diseases.
It's a very natural thing. Farmers work in the soil and they work around animals that have the possibility of disease. I was on a farm tour in Canada and we had that very thing happen. We had been on the farm, and as we came across the border that evening, we were asked that question, and we had to do some cleanup before we came back into our country, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing that USDA allows us to do. Tell us about the Farm Bill and what's on the horizon. Are you seeing any changes? I know agriculture is a dynamic industry. Why does the Farm Bill have to change to keep up with modern agriculture?
Well, I think one of the reasons why is we have a global trading arena now, and we basically export about 1/3 of all of our production, especially if you're looking at corn, soybeans, feed grains, meat, pork. In order to trade with other countries, we have to make sure we're playing on a level playing field. And so we want to make sure we're not doing something that will distort our production, just as we don't want them to distort their production to us. We wouldn't want to see the Brazilian government spending $40 billion a year to subsidize its farmers' soybean production, and likewise they don't want to see the same from us. So the biggest impetus right now to reform is the World Trade Organization talks. And when people express concern about that, I say it's only going to be really good for you, because it's going to put everyone else on a level playing field with us. Yes, it might mean we have to lower our subsidy payments, but there are going to be more market opportunities out there for us.
Isn't it a wonderful thing that we can produce the majority of our agricultural needs right here in the United States, and some countries can't?
That's right.
That's why we have to keep good trading partners. Give me, can you off the top of your head, some countries that cannot just
sure.
physically grow enough commodities to feed their populace?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Japan, I can't think of how many millions of people they have, but I think Tokyo is like 12 million people. They just physically do not have enough land to feed their own people, and that's why they import close to 50%, I think, of their food products. You'll have other countries like the Philippines, Asia, where they can produce a lot of crops and a lot of tropical crops, but they can't produce basic feed grains on a competitive basis to feed to hogs or cattle or dairy cattle or whatever they might need for their protein needs. And so those, along with, if you look at Cuba or Bermuda, anything that's an island nation, those countries would have difficulties. And then places like Iceland, places where climate just does not allow them to produce their own food, other than eating fish. They need to bring in feed grains and things from elsewhere.
How does that exchange happen? Is it all currency exchange, or is there such thing as bartering corn for cocoa or soybeans for rubber products? Is there any examples of that?
It works a lot better bartering if you have a large multinational that deals in both products, but mostly it's done on contracts and cash for product basis.
What about the future of agriculture? Is it bright? Is it something that other people should be involved in? And how about our consumers today? Should they be happy with American agriculture?
Absolutely. I think it's got a very bright future. We're one of the most competitive agricultural nations in the world. We still have a great climate. We have good respect for farmers, and consumers, I think, are pretty happy with how things are. So I think the future is very bright.
Great words, Tamara. I really appreciate that. Thank you for being with us today and bringing the worldly insight and the Washington Review as far as agriculture. And we'd like to thank you for being with us today. We hope that you're enjoying our programs that we bring to you to give you an inside look at Champaign County agriculture through the eyes of producers and folks who are involved in the policy of keeping agriculture strong for all of us here in the United States. So I hope you'll tune in again and catch our next program here on Champaign County Today. Until then, I'm Dennis Riggs, your host. Thanks for watching.